Hello and welcome. So, this is a video on the Oikos and Polis in ancient Greek. Thought, a little mini lecture. Very general. This is very general. I thought I would just do a little video because this is something that I think needs to be demonstrated better. The division between Oikos and Polis. So, Oikos. Let's begin with the definition. Oikos comes from the Greek word household, encompassing the family, the home, the property, and the servants. It is the root of the word economy. Oikos plus nomos, meaning we get economy. Means household management. So it's different to home. If you think, oh, home, this is different. This is a kind of almost a more existential term. Home. Household. It's different. It's more of an anthropological term, I would say. It's observing a social space, which is anthropological. And then you got the polis, and the polis is basically I would say it's anything from civic society to the state, to the military, to the church, to things which are civic or collective, more specifically. Whereas oikos is something which is smaller. It's to do with the household. Okay, so these terms originally come from Aristotle, who, in his Politics, lays out this distinction pretty early on. It's basic distinction, and I think Aristotle, being someone who is very much a kind of systematizer of Greek thought, is clearly getting this from earlier sources of Greek thought, which I'm going to talk about. He's getting it. So Aristotle is very much someone who kind of takes what is implicitly there within Greek thinking, ancient Greek thinking, and he sort of systematizes or codifies it, or makes it more rationally explicit. This is kind of what Aristotle does, is why he writes the way he does. So Aristotle really thought that this was the really fundamental. If you want to understand what we call society, and the term is not very good, but if we want to understand society, or we want a kind of sociological understanding of the world we're in, we need to begin with this distinction. We begin with this distinction, and this is, I would say, at the heart of ancient Greek thinking, is thinking about this distinction, thinking through this distinction, thinking from within this distinction. This is kind of where it comes from, right? And why is it important for the ancient Greeks? Perhaps because they developed a city-state, a more complex form of social organization earlier than other people who were living in, for example, a tribal community, hunter-gatherer communities. I mean, a lot of the or just agricultural communities, depending on what part of the world you're in. A lot of the agricultural communities that had not formed yet into a city-state probably didn't foresee the division between a polis and a oikos. They perhaps perceived themselves to be living in a group, but this group didn't reveal yet a sort of tension within it. Something about the city-state, we can speculate, which forced upon the people living inside of it a better understanding of this distinction, this tension. Somewhat because the political and governmental and military organization was more complex and bigger. That's one reason. Perhaps we have a revelation of this distinction. And on the other hand, I think you may have a revelation of this distinction because households change a lot when you've got a city-state. When you've got a city-state and you're amassing wealth, for example, the households get completely different, right? Think of how, like, the family and how the household has changed in the course of history because of technology, because of economy, because of urbanization. These things just radically change the nature of, like, if you're living in an agrarian traditional society in, in the time of the ancient Greeks, and you're a Celt or whatever, and you're living in an agrarian society, you've got like, there's a kind of more stable understanding of the household and the family. It's more minimalistic, simplistic. It's probably psychologically healthier in many ways. When you get this larger formation of the oika of the city state, and you've got more trade, you've got forms of imperial conquest, you've got more complicated social, political governance systems. It kind of distorts and disrupts everything in a way which is, I think, revealing this tension. So I actually want to go to a perhaps surprising source. We're going from Aristotle, but then we're sort of looking back a little bit from Aristotle. I think Aristotle, as I said before, was someone who sort of made more rationally explicit certain things that were less explicitly implicated in Greek culture and Greek thinking prior to Aristotle. One example here is Aeschylus and his Oresteia, and particularly the story of Agamemnon. Agamemnon returning home from Troy. If you read this play, the basic story is that Agamemnon returns home. He brings with him, I think it's Cassandra, who's a Trojan princess, and he has sacrificed his daughter in order to kind of appease the gods or something like this, in order to get goodwill and favor, so that he can have better success. A bit like Stannis, if you watch Game of Thrones, I'm pretty sure George R. R. Martin stole this, or not stole this. I mean, he's kind of reusing the motif. When Stannis sacrificed his daughter for battle, because the fire goddess witch woman tells him that would be a good idea. It didn't work in Game of Thrones. He sacrificed his daughter for nothing. But in the Greek pantheon of Homeric mythology and storytelling, it did work, because the Greeks won the Trojan War, and so Agamemnon returns home to his wife, who's waiting for him to come home, and he brings with him a concubine, which causes jealousy, and he brings with him the news that the daughter's dead. So you see how the ambition of Greek heroes, in this case Agamemnon, disturbed and destabilized the household. He is not only absent for 10 years, or whatever the Trojan War was, he comes back after a long absence, and we get the same motif with Odysseus. Odysseus, after the Trojan War, he returns home, he's being missing for 10 years, and the household is in a complete state of chaos. A similar situation with Aeschylus and his Oresteia, that he returns home, and the wife is originally looking forward to seeing him, and now she's very excited, but then the daughter's dead, and he brings home a concubine, and then the wife goes crazy, and she stabs Agamemnon and stabs Cassandra, the concubine. I wrote a Substack piece on this. I'll put the link in the description. You can check it out. What I wanted to explore in this play was thrasos, which is this Greek idea of boldness or ambition, and how the Greeks understood thrasos and boldness. In this play in particular, you see how thrasos is literally depicted in the poetry as a kind of entity or a kind of force. There's other words for this, like furies. People are probably more familiar with this. You might say, "Oh, he's been carried away with the furies." This is a kind of phrase which is popular in Ireland, where I'm from. I don't know; it could be popular in other places, but it's carried away with the Furies. Um, and these Furies are sort of like these weird sort of, they're not gods necessarily. They're within the branch of mythology that is kind of within the supernatural, but they're not exactly gods like Poseidon or Zeus or something. They're sort of these lower ranking beings that are somewhat divine, um, somewhat demonic too, you could even say. Um, but they represent in this play Thrasos, which is ambition, and there's a sense here of kind of sacrifice, as he sacrifices his daughter in order to be militarily successful, and it this sort of initiates a sequence of events which ends up destroying the household. So this is an important tension between the Polis and the Oikos. And I say Polis and the Oikos because the Polis is the thing which organizes warfare. The households don't organize warfare. The households don't deal with warfare. The households may benefit from warfare in terms of wealth, but they don't organize it. The organization of warfare is happening in the Polis. And the expression of Thrasos, the expression of ambition, is at least organized in the Polis. In the Polis, men who are heads of state, generals, all of the heroic archetypes are Polis-centric men. They're not, Achilles has this choice between, do you want to live a long life and settle down and have family and be happy, or do you want eternal glory? In this sense, he's making a decision between Polis and Oikos. Oikos is presented in his ultimatum as being a oikocentric existence, and he's contemplating, of course, going home from the war and not fighting, and he's on the boats and he's waiting and he's considering, and he's got a lot of internal tension. He doesn't know what to do. Glory, this ancient ideal of glory and fame, and eternal recognition and so forth, this is very much caught up in the tension of Polis and Oikos, because it's through the Polis that this is possible, and it's often by sacrificing something within the Oikos. For example, in Agamemnon's situation, sacrificing the daughter, or in Achilles' situation, sacrificing a kind of stable, happy life. There's a sacrifice of something in the Oikos in order to live out the highest ideal of the highest heroic ideal, which is only possible in anthropological terms, in political terms, we could say, even through the Polis, because how are you going to organize such ambitious military expeditions without a complex organizational capacity? There's another way to read this play, which is to say that the household brought this upon itself. It's not simply, the domestic conflict and catastrophe of Agamemnon's wife stabbing him, murdering him, is not just brought on simply by him killing the daughter, or sacrificing the daughter, but also because he brought home a concubine. So you see how jealousy is created. The spoils of war, the spoils of conquest, bring home things which can initiate jealousy. Greece had become much richer, as many successful city-states, or later on in history, nations or empires, have been through success in things which are only possible through the Polis, basically, like large things which require large-scale social organization, like warfare, like imperialism, like certain kinds of trade as well. These things create spoils or wealth, and this initiates jealousy, which erodes the fabric of the society and erodes the sort of domestic cohesion. So you again see another form of tension here. So in this sense, Thrasos, boldness, isn't simply something that we could apply to the heroic ideal, but it's also something we can apply to ambitions of wealth, and how those ambitions of wealth, when they succeed, actually can often create a destruction of the home. So I want to read a little bit of the dialogue which describes Thrasos, which describes this boldness, this ambition in the Oriste. Um, so this is all from the chorus. The chorus is singing this, of course. He says, "The offspring of a lion was nurtured in a man's home, simply taken from the teats and milk it loved. In the opening strains of life, it was tame and a darling to children, and to the old people delightful." I'll read my commentary on this. This is from my Substack piece. Immediately, we see a setting in which a harmonious domestic sphere is offered, yet housing the offspring of a lion, yet again still tamed and loved by the old and young alike. And it continues. Then time worked on it, and it showed what its parents had been. It gave those who had brought it up the thanks of carnage and ruin in their flocks. To the feast it prepared, no one was invited, and the home was polluted with blood. Helpless, the pain for the household, a slaughtering curse in its power, through a God's will, the new child reared in a household was disaster's priest himself. Accordingly, when we encounter something emerging that challenges and conflicts with this harmonious domestic sphere, disaster's priest himself. Yet note that no moral failure is offered as a cause, rather both a sort of lineage determinism, what his parents had been, and also God's will, a higher order determination. These are things which brings forth the priest disaster. So this isn't being presented to us as a moral issue. This is important to note. This is being presented to us as a kind of predetermined reality of existence, pretty much. There's this eternal tension between these two spaces in the society, and it's sort of like it was kind of impossible to like morally question heroic ideals or morally question ambition back then. It was like, well, that was just like not the way they thought. So it's described as a kind of determined conflict, which was always determined to happen. Okay, so he continues. Says, I think a spirit of windless calm arrived in Ilium at the start. Jewel of wealth, soothing bad omens. Excuse me. Arrow shot, soft from the eyes, flower of love that gnawed at the heart. Then she swerved off. Then she made the marriage, bitter in its fulfillment. What a sad house where she stayed, where she kept company. There swept Priam's sons, a fury, a bride who brought weeping under the escort of Zeus, the guest god. So, okay, I'll keep reading. When we see the disaster unfold with a shot which came soft from the eyes, that then swerves off again, just like the ambiguity of Agamemnon's wife, who takes vengeance for ambiguous reasons, for the daughter or for the marital jealousy. We see a corresponding ambiguity if we attempt to understand where exactly such a fury is stemming from. A fury, a bride that brought weeping. Is this Helen of Troy herself, somebody that was invited into a domestic sphere, Priam's household, yet also with her brought war? Or is it referring to the lust and desire of Paris, who in taking her from Troy initiated the war? Or does it refer to the wrath that was unleashed by the Greeks throughout their war? The reference to a lion, to a son of a lion inside a peaceful home, could be a reference to Achilles, who responded to Hector's attempt at burial agreements before their duel by stating, there could be no covenant between lions and men. Or does it refer to Agamemnon's organization of the war itself? In likelihood, the fury here depicts the totality of events that are brought into reality through a series of decisions and impulses that can only be possible in relation to people that contain some thrasos in their dispositions. This is like a situational kind of drama, the aftermath of the Trojan War is a kind of situational drama in which all these forms of ambition are kind of playing off each other and determining this sort of tragic outcome. I keep reading. Okay. And this is my favorite line from the play. I think this is really, really great writing. It says, of course, it's a translation, of course, but nonetheless, it's well translated. it says, an ancient arrogance begets its own, to grow in mortal misery. Sooner or later, when the time comes that is ordained, this fresh rancor is born, this spirit enduring all battles, all wars, unholy insolence, full of black ruin for the palace, the image of its parents. So, black ruin for the palace, I think, is the sort of epitome of the um, tension, I think you can say, between the Polis and the Oikos. Bring up Plato, and again, we could go into a lot more detail on Plato here. I've done other videos on Plato's Guardians in my book, Defensology, Human Aggressivity and the Civilizing Principle. You can read a lot more about Plato's Guardians if you're interested, or you can just read the Republic. That's probably the best source. But I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on explaining the Guardians. I'm going to kind of assume that the listener has some knowledge of this, but the Guardians are basically Plato's kind of ideal citizen in the Republic. He speculated a citizen that is the leaders are chosen from. They're kind of an elite class, right? This kind of an elite group of people that are educated in a specific way, that are separated from society in a specific way, that are also organized in terms of family life in a specific way, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit. Plato's Guardians, also called the Phulake, is a Greek term, are basically soldiers that are also trained in philosophy, and then some of them are then selected for political leadership. So they're sort of soldiers primarily, but then a select amount would also be trained in dialectics and probably other forms of more intellectual education that Plato considered important. And then again, if you're really good at that too, maybe you can be a political leader. That was Plato's ideal. And these Guardians are very, what I would call oikoskeptical. They're oikosuspicious, oikoskeptical. That they're not an oikocentric group of people. That they really, really are a manifestation of civic idealism. They're really, really a manifestation of the polis. They are heroic warriors. They are philosophically wise. They are concerned with big issues of the state. They are not exactly, housebound consumers. And that is an important thing to note if you're thinking about, again, the Greek relationship between the Oikos and the Polis. I would say that much more so than Aristotle, Plato was oikoskeptical. That he really, really thought the Oikos was a problem, right? Again, I think this could be caused by the amassing of wealth in Athens, and seeing the social tensions that caused, and seeing the disunity that caused, and then losing the Peloponnesian War to the Spartans. That Plato probably saw this as like, well, he's got to think about why this happened. Why did we lose the Peloponnesian War? Why are we in a kind of decline state? Even I've argued before that Plato is perceiving of Athens in a state of decline. So Plato's Guardians are people that, as readers of Plato will know, they don't own property. They are not particularly interested in amassing wealth. They're not really involved in things like trade. They're not involved in the economy very much. They're really involved in war, philosophy, and politics. This is what they're really interested in. And this is why I say they're oiko-skeptical. And even the family abolishment argument that Plato offers in the Republic, where the Guardians have this peculiar and probably not very practically implementable, but nonetheless peculiar and interesting form of method of reproduction, where they would collectively reproduce. They would sort of gather together in some sort of festivals, because there could be men and women who are guardians. I think this is one of the reasons that Plato decided women could be guardians, because he wanted basically a kind of eugenical plan how they reproduce. Um, and the guardians would get together and they would basically have sex, but the children wouldn't be raised in like what you would in our modern terms we would call like a nuclear family household or something. They'd be raised more collectively. The details of this are not very well written by Plato. He didn't really think this through in a lot of detail. The chapter on this is nothing but a few pages, really. But it's an interesting thing to contemplate, because it kind of seems like the stupidest part of Plato or something. Like, it kind of seems ridiculous and not very well thought out. But it makes sense, at least in terms of his education of the guardians, and insofar if you look at the guardians as oiko-skeptical, that they're really expressing a domination of the oikos from the polis. That the polis is really the strong thing, and Plato is trying to figure out a way, how do we reproduce ourselves without creating these like kind of petty small family units that are always demanding more comfort and wealth, and are sort of rejecting civic idealism in favor of their own individual prosperity, individual advantage. How do you create like meritocracies? How do you create a stronger sense of justice? Because the oikos is always a problem for that, because you've always got people who want to cheat. I mean, like, look at the way upper middle class parents behave within education. Our education system is ruined because of the oikos. It's not ruined because of crazy administrators and crazy. Okay, there's too much administration in education. I do agree with that, but it's not ruined because of politicians. It's not ruined because of because, in my opinion, because of like ideologically motivated professors and teachers. That is sometimes a problem, I will admit that, but I think it's ultimately motivated by like middle class and upper middle class parents basically wanting their kid to win. They see education as a game, and they want their kid to win, not other kids to win, and they're willing to sort of lower the standard. They're willing to cheat. They're willing to distort real merit in order to achieve that. There's a huge amount of kind of oikocentric kind of egotism, we could nearly say, which often dissolves processes which create better societies and better outcomes in the long run, such as education, for example. So Plato is he's really pissed off at this, basically, and he wants to regulate this and control this better. He wants a real education system that really rewards the talented people and really isn't distorted by kind of petty small personal interests. I think this is a huge motivating force behind why he's trying to get these guardians to just reproduce collectively and not be kind of soccer moms, and not be, stay-at-home dads, and not be like, oh, my kids and my house and Christmas with the family and all this sort of thing, which is like very much sort of always encouraging, I think, a very particularistic inclination to use to sort of distribute the wealth of a successful society for your own interests, or to sort of disrupt the social processes of education or politics to suit you and not to suit a civic ideal. Now Aristotle obviously sort of pushes back against Plato here on this. Aristotle is kind of, I think, one of the reasons Aristotle is trying to think about this division of oikos and polis, because Aristotle is a little bit more defensive of the oikos. He thinks, okay, well, you're going a bit too far, Plato. He has lots of arguments, for example, over like what it would really be like to live in a collectively reproduced society. He would thinks that the kids would just know who the dad is. They would just know, and he's probably correct on that. Like, he would just know unconsciously or something, right? Who the dad is. Forms of issues of identity and illegitimacy, and Aristotle's got plenty of pretty good arguments to push back against this on. So you can decide yourself whose side you want to be on. But yeah, there's a oiko skepticism within Plato, certainly, and I think this brings up a lot of interesting issues that are very relevant today. I say issues of domestication. Are we too domesticated? We actually know that men that are in long-term relationships with families and kids at a younger age actually have lower testosterone rates. This is like a literal study, apparently. I mean, okay, I haven't looked at the exact studies, but I was listening to a podcast and someone was talking about these studies. I'll take it. I'll it could be wrong, but there's like a literal physiological effect sometimes which happens if people live too much of a kind of domestic, if men live too much in the household, I suppose you could say, and they're not connected to other things. Particularly with urbanization, it's a bit different if you're on a farm, because if you're on a farm and you're doing manual work and you're outside and you're fucking breeding animals, you're just a bit more sort of physiologically present in the world. But there's a real risk of urbanization, I will say. And again, this is why these issues sort of are stimulated by urbanization, because the city state was more urbanized by our modern standards, not very urbanized, but much more urbanized than other societies like the Celts, for example, or the Germanic tribes that were living in agricultural settings or in maybe even hunter-gatherer settings. I don't know. I'm not an expert on that time, but um, there's an issue of domestication with um, certain increases of comforts and of social anthropological space creation within a successful, especially urbanized societies. Domestication is one of the threats, and if the men are too domesticated and too comfortable, of course, they're not going to make good soldiers. If they're too provincial and they're too comfortable and self-satisfied, it's kind of like Nietzsche's last man problem in many ways, I think. Um, they may not be interested in getting involved in issues of the state and issues of war and peace and issues of philosophy and issues of religion. Maybe they're going to be sort of just these provincial people who are kind of petty and selfish, and they're not going to be particularly useful to a polis. This is always an issue for a polis. I mean, we're seeing it right now in Europe. Suddenly, these technocratic politicians who have spent the last 50 years, 60, 70 years telling us to be individualistic consumers, peace and love and consumption and private life, and they're suddenly telling us, oh, war is coming back and we need to be prepared for war, and maybe we're going to have conscription again. You see what I mean? Like the polis is like going, wait a minute, we sort of neglected this issue of war and peace here, and suddenly we have to think about that, and then they're sort of initiating processes to try how. So you see how the polis itself has to sort of navigate this tension between the oikos and the polis. And it doesn't want us to be all like warriors the whole time. It doesn't want us to be all strong, but it also doesn't want us to be too domesticated, because it needs us to fight sometimes. It's a very vulgar rationalization. This is not Plato's rationalization. This is a kind of modern rationalization, but nonetheless, there's a notable similarity there. So things like family abolition, I think we need to look at these in the context of this tension between the polis and the oikos. Modern feminism is a weird example of anti-family, oikocentric anti-familyism, because it's completely against the cultivation of manly traits, cultivation of manly virtues. I don't think feminism is particularly interested in the polis. I think feminism is primarily interested in economics. I think it's interested in getting more consumer benefits, maximizing utilitarian individual outcomes for women, and climbing the corporate ladder. Is interested in the economics. I don't think it's particularly interested. It's kind of interested in education to a certain extent, but I don't think it's really interested in issues of war and peace. And it's not interested in issues of philosophy, or really statecraft in itself. It's more, but anyway, that's another complicated topic. Cookery, I mean, like, I don't want to lean into the really sort of vulgar cynical discussions of people like Andrew Tate or something, but you do see how an excessively domesticated society will eventually lead to kind of polemical backlashes of unhappy men, particularly, who are going to talk about things like cookery and emasculated kind of housebound men. There's this really funny skit in an Irish comedy program called The Savage Eye, and it was a kind of satire show. It's not on the air anymore. And we had a female president. Not prime minister is different to the president. We never actually had a female prime minister, have we? No, we haven't. But we often have female president. They're like they're not. They don't do anything. They're what's the word? They're show and tell politicians. But we've had a few women ones, and there was a woman who was the president. I think it was Mary McAleese, and she had a husband who was this really small, stupid-looking, quiet man who used to always sit beside her while she would like go on these really long tirades about things that she would talk about, and the Savage Eye did a skit about this, and they put a bird cage over her husband's head, and then she would open the bird cage for him to speak, and he would just make bird noises. He would squeak, 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 and then she would close it again, and then she used to call him her housebound it. It's really funny. This is the kind of thing that eventually will lead to polemical backlash. So you got to consider that as well, and that's something that you can talk about between the Oikos and the Polis, because when you have a Polis-centric society, I think it's going to be you're less likely to be domesticating people to a kind of ridiculous degree, and the role of men in society is going to be, I think, better if it's a Polis-centric society. Okay, birth gaps. That's a crisis of the household. That's the crisis of reproduction. We're talking about Plato's guardians. We're talking about overcoming these issues of excessive domestication and unhappy family arrangements. Kind of experiments in social reproduction. I mean, I could imagine a future not too long, and I'm very critical of biotech, so I'm not exactly supporting this or anything, but I could imagine a future in soon where artificial wombs are developed, and a lot of people in society, people in government, men in general might just go, all right, well, I can't get women to be a mother anymore because they're too individualistic and they're too whatever, so we'll just get an artificial womb. Now this probably sounds like a complete disaster, but nonetheless, you see how these experiments in reproduction, you could perceive of anti-oiko forms of reproduction, like we rely on the oikos in the household to perform the role of reproduction, but you see how even from Plato he was sort of thinking about, oh, how could you have reproduction which isn't oikocentric? How could you have polis-centric reproduction? And I think things like genetic engineering and cloning are a possible solution to that, as terrifying as that sounds. Yeah, remilitarization, I said it before, when a society has issues of war, it's going to suddenly have to try and regulate the excessively oikocentric character of a society. That's already happening now in our time. Last, why is this stuff important? Well, it's important because of the things I just mentioned, but more generally, I think the oikos and the polis tension, this sort of anthropological dualism, we could nearly say, is helpful. It kind of gets us out of this abstraction of the individual and the society. Like we think of the society as the society, like it's a big collective whole, or we think of individuals and then we think of collectivities, and we sort of create these contrasts to them. I'm not saying that there isn't an individual and there isn't a society. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. But I think these are often unhelpful theoretical frames. And actually, if we think of what we call society or the individual as something which is caught in between a tension between an oikos and a polis, actually is much more helpful for thinking. This kind of Greek way of thinking, ancient Greek way of thinking, which you think of the oikos and the polis, and this modern sociological way of thinking, which I think is more Anglo, kind of Anglo-centric, kind of modern sociology, which is thinking more of society, individual. I think it's time to challenge that framework and think of polis and oikos. Yeah, and again, the excessive domestication of the polis is perhaps the biggest crisis issue, and how politics is, how the polis, how politics itself is a task of trying to navigate this tension between these two anthropological spheres and trying to regulate the oikocentric anthropological sphere. Now, this can happen in a bad way too, right? I think one thing we're seeing happen at the moment is the breakdown between privacy and public and private life, and that's kind of driven by technology too, like smartphones. But also things like COVID, during COVID when, you're expected to show personal information about your medical situation to a restaurant just so you can eat inside or something. We saw this during COVID, or an employer, so they knew you were vaccinated or whatever. This is kind of a breakdown of the public-private spheres. We're kind of seeing the private sphere often being encroached upon, and sort of things which used to be private and personal are being it's being demanded that these things become public. The media does this the whole time. It interferes with people. If you're a famous person or a politician, it's always ready to talk about your personal life and make that an issue of public concern. Kind of politicization of things like gender and sexuality, I think, kind of encroach upon our private life a little too much, and they sort of make everything very public, and this can be very detrimental too. So it's not exactly like we should always be team Polis and anti Oikos. It's simply just to look at this tension between the two and think about the role of politics as something which is basically existing within this tension, and it's there's an attempt from the political to try overcome this tension, try create a kind of negotiation or a mediation or a harmony between the two. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's that. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe, and I put links in the description. If you want to buy my book, then buy it. And yeah, thank you for listening.